Welcome back. All right, so I was looking at the numbers today and looking around at the stats, and so I got to thinking of February 7th. We're about 2 months out from the end of the season, and looking at previous seasons on this date and saying how many times have we seen teams that are outside of the playoffs bounce other teams that are above the playoff line out? It's rare, right? It should be rare. We should be at the point now where the best teams are above the line, and the ones that aren't quite there just aren't there. So we shouldn't see that many times where teams, make a big charge at the end of the year. Now, I'm wearing Ottawa because they're the most famous on the board with a huge run that they went on, but they are rare. It is very, very rare that we see that. That's all the way back in 2015 that happened. So that's 9 years ago. Feeling old yet. Anyways, so last year on this date, we had different wildcard teams in the East than we would see at the end of the season. Washington and Pittsburgh were wildcards number one and number two. The Islanders were tied with Pittsburgh in points, but they played four extra games. And this is where that discussion comes in about you have to win your games in hand. This is one of the reasons why I don't talk about games in hand, because teams can lose those games in hand as Pittsburgh did last year. In fact, Florida was 3 points behind Pittsburgh, and they'd played three more games than Pittsburgh as well, and they made the playoffs. So the number of games played on at this point, and teams will mention it a lot. Well, we've played four less games, our points percentage is better. Sure, we have two less points, but however, you've got to keep in mind that at this point in the year, when you've played four more games, that means this team here has four more games to play over that shortened schedule. It can get really rough. So, yes, there are teams who have games in hand currently in the National Hockey League. That means their schedule is much busier than the other teams that they're fighting for that other playoff spot with, and that can have negative effect on their record. Now, 2022 is a fascinating one here. You'll notice there's no Western teams that dropped out in 2023. 2022, the Vegas Golden Knights were first in the Pacific, and injuries absolutely decimated them. They ended up missing the playoffs. The Anaheim Ducks were third in the Pacific, and yeah, it was 2 years ago I was talking about, hey, so the worst of it's behind the Anaheim Ducks. It was not. 2023, things got much worse. In 2024, it's been another really rough year for them. The Oilers were 2 points behind the second wild card, or 3 points behind the number two wild card, which was Calgary. The Dallas Stars were 4 points behind the number two wild card, Calgary, and both of them ended up making the playoffs. Dallas shows up on this board a lot, comparatively speaking, with other teams, which I think is fascinating. But anyways, that's your 2022. Now, as mentioned, 2021 and 2020 are not on the board for reasons I've already specified. 2019, Montreal was third in the Atlantic. They would not make the playoffs in 2019. 3 points behind the number two wild card, Pittsburgh, were the Carolina Hurricanes. Carolina would make the playoffs that year. Pittsburgh, of course, did make it. They're not on the board as a team that dropped out. Out west, we had one team drop out as well. The Minnesota Wild were the number one wild card on this date in 2019. They would end up dropping out. Colorado, they were 2 points back of the number two wild card, which was St. Louis. So 2019, we always hear about, oh, St. Louis came out of nowhere and they were last in the NHL, yada yada. But by February 7th, they were already in a playoff spot. So the reality that they were at the bottom, sure, but their record was not terrible, and they were able to get back above the playoff line by this date. 2018, St. Louis is third in the Central on this date. They would end up missing the playoffs. Very, very barely missing the playoffs in 2018, I might add. The number one wild card was Dallas. They would miss the playoffs. So Dallas goes from a charge to make the playoffs in 2022 to missing the playoffs when they've been a wild card in 2018. The Colorado Avalanche were 1 point behind the second wild card, which was Minnesota. Colorado would make the playoffs. I believe they won that final game of the year against St. Louis to make those playoffs. And Anaheim was 1 point behind the number two wild card, Minnesota. They would make the playoffs as well. That would be the last time that Anaheim's made the playoffs until now. So that's two out west that made the playoffs that otherwise were below the line. Nobody in the East that year that fell out that was in the top eight. And this, again, that's remarkable to me. There was nobody in the East in 2022 that dropped out, but there was a big separation between the teams that were above and below the playoff line in 2022. 2017, the number two wild card was Philadelphia. They would end up dropping out. They were 1 point clear of Boston. Boston would end up jumping above the playoff line. So just a very, very close run there. and that was Boston repaying a favor that Philadelphia had granted to them in 2016. So Boston was number 3 in the Atlantic that year on this date, and Philadelphia was 4 points behind the second wild card, which was Pittsburgh. So Philadelphia ends up making the playoffs. Boston ends up missing. So, yeah, they just end up trading who's in and who's out. Those are the only 2 times that Philadelphia's on the board. Boston would be on the board again, however. The number 2 wild card on this date in 2016 was the Colorado Avalanche. Minnesota was 3 points behind that second wild card, Colorado Avalanche. Minnesota would make the playoffs. Colorado would not. 2015, the number 2 wild card on this date was the Boston Bruins. They would miss the playoffs. 14 points behind that number 2 wild card were the Ottawa Senators. You get the Hamburglar in net there, and an amazing run by the Ottawa Senators that sadly did not lead to a long playoff run. Andrew Hammond, his famousness begins in 2015, and he became a beloved figure, the Hamburglar, for Ottawa fans. Now out west, you had San Jose second in the Pacific. They would end up missing the playoffs, and Minnesota ends up jumping into the playoffs again, so they did this back-to-back years. Minnesota was 5 points back of the second-place wildcard team, this Calgary. So Minnesota pretty good at comebacks. They did fall out of the playoffs here, but they jump into the playoffs these years. The problem this year is if you want to say, hey, Minnesota may be a comeback, they're further out. So they'd be more in the miraculous Ottawa area of things if they ended up making the playoffs this season, which again, this is 9 years ago. Since then, we haven't had a team go on this amazing run when they've been that far out. And back to 2014, the Toronto Maple Leafs, they were the number 1 wild card at this point on this date in 2014. The Columbus Blue Jackets were 1 point behind the second wild card spot that was occupied by the Detroit Red Wings. They would make the playoffs, and Toronto would not. And of course, in 2020, these teams would meet in the play-in round, where Columbus would knock out Toronto. And this is where the debate comes in, because I've seen that even recently of, well, Toronto didn't technically make the playoffs. True, however, the play-in round qualifies as playoff stats. So it's kind of a mess. They shouldn't qualify as playoff stats if they're not considered to be playoffs. So, yeah, it's just one of those murky areas of things. And then you've got the Arizona Coyotes. They were the number 2 wild card in 2014 on this date. Dallas shows up again. So Dallas on the board, total of 3 times. They were 2 points behind the second wild card, Phoenix Coyotes. They were still Phoenix at that point. And of course became Arizona. I believe it was 2016 they became Arizona. So it is not unheard of for a team to come out of nowhere, as Ottawa did it all those years ago, but it was all those years ago. You got 4 points here, 3 here, 3 here, 3 ones here, 4 points here, 1 here, 14, 5, 2, 1. So basically, the lesson from this would seem to be, yes, there are times where a team that's nowhere near a playoff spot might get in that's this far back with 2 months to go, but it is exceedingly rare. And I do think this is something that GMs take into account. So once we get to around the trade deadline, if a team's 4 more points out, don't be surprised if they sell, because the GM's probably pretty realistic at that point that getting into the playoffs is not just about winning your games. You need the teams ahead of you to not get points, and you need to jump past multiple teams in a lot of these cases as well. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. As always, I just thought this was a fun thing to look at, looking back over the last decade and all that. So let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video, or just because you feel like it. Thank you guys so much for all your support as always, and I will talk to you again soon.